A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Today is October 7th, exactly one day from October 7th, 2023, which is one of the darkest days in recent Jewish history. The Jewish people suffered more death and destruction on this day a year ago than they have since the Holocaust in World War II. Almost 1,200 people were killed, the majority of them innocent civilians, including women, children, babies, the elderly. And nearly 100 of these 1,200 people were actually foreign nationals in Israel at the time. And as well as this, there was widespread reporting of torture and sexual abuse. And almost 250 people were kidnapped and imprisoned in Gaza. Many to be brutalized, tortured, raped, and some even killed. It is not even known to this day how many of these hostages remain alive, but about 100 have been released or rescued. Our special guest today to mark this day and to discuss the Clash of Civilisations is Dr. Mark Durie. He's the founding director of the Institute for Spiritual Awareness and senior research fellow at the Melbourne School of Theology, and he's a Christian expert on Islam. And Mark Durie, I want to welcome you to 2020 today.
Great
As I
to
said,
be with you.
It's great to have you. You are an expert on Islam, and it is a year since October 7th, 2023. Share with me your reflections on October 7th last year, Mark.
I think something broke on October 7th last year. And what broke on the Israeli side was, I suppose, the hope of living in peace. Interesting, many of the victims of the killings on October the 7th had been fairly favourably disposed towards the Palestinians. They'd been active, some of them had been activists for a peaceful solution of the conflict. But many Israelis who'd had that general orientation were disabused of that they were so deeply shocked. So I think what it did is it pushed Israel into a position where they felt the only way forward for them was to defeat Hamas. They had no other alternative because the thought of having this happen over and over again many times potentially was just unacceptable. So Israel has really decided to win the war, which was not the case before then.
Mark, we were just talking about how something has definitely changed in the psyche of Israel, the nation state of Israel, since October 7th last year. And you did touch on, and some of our listeners may not realise this, that some of the settlements or the villages, they call them kibbutzes, but the villages in Israel that were really hammered the most on October 7th last year were actually inhabited by people who were very friendly, as you said, to their Palestinian neighbours. They would pick up Palestinians at the border and take them to Israeli hospitals for medical care. They would try and do their best to build positive relationships. And I suppose they were the ones, weren't they, Mark, least expecting a conflict and least prepared for a conflict. And sadly, many of those people suffered on October 7th, didn't they?
They did. And it was a huge shock to many Israelis. And I think it changed people's understanding of the conflict. So many came to believe that the only option for Israel is to defeat their enemy, to win a battle, to destroy Hamas, basically, that there was no other viable alternative for them. And that's been a huge shift in Israel.
Yeah, and you are an expert on Islam, and after the October 7th dust settled and, the numbers started coming through, the casualties and the amount of death and destruction and just how widespread it was, were you surprised, Mark, that in 2023 something like that could happen?
No, I wasn't surprised. The incitement to violence against non-believers in the Quran is quite marked and strong. There's a verse that says that a prophet should not take prisoners until he's made a wide slaughter in the land, and that's sort of what they did. They killed. Most of the victims were killed, and some were taken captive. The idea of taking captives and using them as a bargaining chip was also part of the origin of Islam. And Hamas's original constitution basically is a genocidal document. It anticipates the destruction of Israel completely. And so, I was not at all surprised. I was surprised that how ill prepared the Israelis were, that their border protection turned out to be very weak, and they apparently overlooked or not paid attention to warnings. So that was surprising that they were so vulnerable. But the idea that Hamas would want to kill, I remember one of the fighters called his father and said, "I've killed 10 Jews," and he's so excited. That doesn't surprise me at all. There's been so much incitement towards this in the educational system of the Palestinian territories, and sadly not surprised.
Yeah, and you mentioned a verse in the Quran there where it says, take many or slaughter many before you take a prisoner. Now, when you quote verses like that, are there many Muslims in the world today, and this is for our listeners' benefit, Mark, that would say, well, I don't adhere to that portion of the Quran? Because obviously in the Christian Bible, there are many verses that Christians will say, well, I don't adhere to that verse. But are you saying, as an expert on Islam, that particular verse that talks about widespread slaughter and bloodshed before you take a prisoner, is that verse believed by every Muslim today, or just by what some would call fundamentalists or fanatics?
That's a complicated answer. The Quran itself is considered to be from God, perfect and unassailable in its perfection. The question is, how do you interpret that? So do you say, well, that was something for then, but not for now? The broad consensus in Islamic tradition has been that the Quran is applicable to every Muslim, and that phase of warfare at the end of the life and ministry of Muhammad, the more violent phase, is sort of mandated for Islam for all time. That's widely held as a principle. Whether an individual buys into that, whether an individual says, "Oh, this is for me," that's another matter. So they might say that's only for then and not for present. But the fact is that it's there and that it's part of the Quran, and that and therefore that it could apply is enough to radicalize people. It's enough to persuade people like the Hamas fighters that their cause is good and should be pursued. So I think if you're going to ask a more general question, that is, what is the proportion of Muslims that have a more radicalized worldview? It's quite significant. It's maybe not the majority in Australia, but you can see from the delight that was expressed by some Muslims in Australia after October 7th, that there are certainly Muslims in Australia who found it's not just unobjectionable but excellent that those killings took place. So there is a significant presence of Muslims in Australia who would be sympathetic to that worldview.
Yeah, it's almost reminiscent, isn't it, of the glee that some of the Nazis, the more extremist Nazis, also felt when they were punishing Jewish people during World War II and even killing them in the concentration camps and the gas chambers. Just that pure, unadulterated hatred that can cause a human being to do such horrible things to another human being. But it is disturbing that we're seeing it even on the streets in Australia. What was your reaction to last week's protest, where I think some people actually had Hezbollah flags and the picture of the leader of Hezbollah who'd just been assassinated by the Israelis, and people holding that up on the streets of Australia? Did that surprise you, Mark?
No, it didn't surprise me. I think radical Islamic perspectives have been present in Australia for many decades. It didn't surprise me that people were coming out in sympathy. I think the purpose of those protests is to intimidate and to undermine support for Israel. And you could say they're courageous in a sense that they're quite aggressive and determined and willing to push the boundaries of what's acceptable. So no, that didn't surprise me either. I mean, I've been tracking more radical Muslim views in Australia for decades now, and these are not new perspectives. I remember 25 years ago picking up some anti-Semitic brochures in a cake shop on Sydney Road, and I contacted B'nai B'rith, which is an organisation that defends Jewish freedoms and so on, and they said, "Oh yes, Sydney Road's a no-go area for Jews." So that's because of the high Muslim presence in that part of Melbourne. And so the idea that it would be unsafe to be a Jew in parts of Melbourne, this is not a new idea. So the hostility that those demonstrations showed is not surprising.
Yeah, but it's also very sad at the same time, isn't it? Because the average Australian does not want this sort of hatred in our society. We want to live in peace. I think despite certain narratives that you may hear, I think Australia is one of the most welcoming countries in the world. We're certainly one of the most multicultural nations in the world. And I live in the suburbs. I've got kids, and I'm involved with kids' schools and sporting activities. And I find the average Aussie quite happy to have people from all over the world living here. We love the food, we love the cafes and the different cultures. But it is disturbing that we're seeing that sort of hatred demonstrated on the streets of Sydney, Melbourne and elsewhere, even over the weekend. But I do want to open up this conversation to callers now. So if you want to join this conversation, maybe you've got a question for Dr. Mark Durie. He is an expert, I should say, on Islam. Maybe you've got a comment about the protests that happened over the weekend or even the protests last week. Or what are your thoughts about the government response? Do you think the Australian government is doing enough, both state and federally, to stamp out these protests happening around our nation, Australia, where we all basically want to live in peace? Give us a call on 1-800-316 316, or you can also just send us a text message on 0447 488 316. That's 0447 488 316. Or if you're listening through the app today, there is a option on the app when you're listening to text in. Hit the text in button, send us a text, join the conversation, or send us a message on Facebook or Instagram as well. I've got Dr. Mark Durie with me. We are discussing the Clash of Civilisations. We're talking about October 7th, a year ago. We're also talking about modern day Australia, our protests happening across our states and our nation. And we'll be back after this short break to discuss this some more.
There are many ways people listen to Vision, including on smart speakers. Just tell your smart speakers to play Vision Christian Radio.
Alexa, play Vision Christian Radio.
Vision.
Yep, it really is that easy. You can also say, play V180 Radio for our music channel. It's just another way that Vision is helping you look to God daily.
It takes a big family to keep Vision on the air across Australia. Individuals, churches and businesses like Edge Planning and Property, WA Planning Services. See edgeplanning.com.au.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
Welcome back. We're remembering October 7th, 2023, the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust of World War II. We're joined by a very special guest, Dr. Mark Durie. He's an expert on Islam, and we're asking you for your thoughts. What are your thoughts or reflections on October 7th from last year? What impact did it have upon you, whether you knew someone there or not? Did it affect you? Did it affect your soul when you read the news and you read the reports about what happened there? Love to hear your thoughts on this, or even what are your thoughts about the protests happening across Australia over the weekend and even last week after the Hezbollah leader was assassinated so effectively by the Israelis, I might add. But we do have a caller. His name is Aaron. I'm not sure if he's calling from Forbes or if his name is Aaron Forbes. Aaron, are you there?
I'm right here, mate.
Are you from Forbes or is your name Forbes?
First name Aaron, second name Forbes.
There you go. Aaron, have you got a comment or a question for Mark today?
No, not really. I was just ringing up to make a song request, man.
You had a song request. Okay. Well, brother, you stay on hold there, and we will get that song out to you. But out of interest, have you been monitoring what's happening over the weekend with the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests, and people sort of protesting when the Israeli government assassinated the Hezbollah leader last week?
No, I've been totally unaware of that. So, yeah.
All good, brother. Well, thank you for calling us, Aaron. Stay on hold there, and we'll take your song request and take it on board, okay?
All right, no worries.
Good on you, mate. Well, Dr. Mark, we'll get back to our topic of conversation. I asked you if you were surprised at the level of brutality that was shown on October 7th last year. You said you weren't because of your understanding of Islam. Are you surprised by the Australian government's response in the last 12 months to the war that is currently in Gaza, is now spread to Lebanon, Syria at times, and potentially may spread to Iran? What are your thoughts on the Australian government's posture?
I think the Labor government is caught between a rock and a hard place because it depends upon the Muslim vote in the western, for example, in the western suburb of Sydney. And they don't want to alienate the Muslim community, who are generally, by and large, really behind the Palestinian cause in this conflict. At the same time, Australia has a policy of support, in general, support for Israel, and Hamas and Hezbollah are prescribed terrorist organisations. So it's really they're walking a political tightrope and trying to find a way through. And one of the problems with that is that they're acting badly, I think, weakly, instead of coming out with a clear support for Israel and its right to respond to violence against itself. Israel's incursions into southern Lebanon have only happened after Hezbollah has fired 9,000 or so rockets into Israel, which began on October the 8th. So they're seeking to stop that barrage. And the government has been weak, I think, in its response, and it's purely because of the political issues. And that's distressing to watch, that our government policy is being driven by very kind of fundamental electoral politics, and not by what should be a fair and reasonable response to what's happening in the Middle East.
Well, it's not really servant leadership, is it, where they're putting the people of Australia first? Because we've got to remember, many Australians have Jewish ancestry. They are Jewish Australians. And I know after October 7th, speaking with one of the Jewish leaders of the city where I live in Australia, they said there were elderly Jewish people in Australia, Australian citizens born and bred here with Jewish ancestry, who are afraid now for their own welfare and safety. And as you said, without a strong stand by our government that we support Israel, we support their right to exist, we support the Jewish people, many of whom, there have been some beautiful Jewish people in Australia's history that have contributed so much, and they just have not felt in the last 12 months that our government is even standing with them. And that's a tragedy, isn't it?
Yes, it's very difficult times for the Jewish community. They're suffering a great deal. And I think at the heart of it is the dehumanization of Jews that Hamas's campaign and Hezbollah's rhetoric also represent, that Jews are seen as somehow not deserving to be treated as human beings and respected as people. And the problem with standing on the sidelines and making hedging statements and refusing to kind of make a stand is that, in a way, the government is endorsing this dehumanization of Jews. And that is dangerous for our harmony. It empowers and emboldens people who have anti-Semitic sentiments. It makes Jews frightened to be here, because if the government won't treat them really as human beings and is sort of avoiding making a comment that would upset the pro-Palestinian sector of our community, then it makes it, it's quite scary. That dehumanization really is at the heart of the issue for what's happening in Australia now.
Yeah, it's horrible. And I can imagine if there were thousands of rockets launched towards Australia from New Zealand, as an example, our closest neighbour, one of our closest neighbours, and imagine overseas countries saying to our government, we want a measured response. We want a proportionate response. I can tell you that I think the average Aussie, the only measuring we would want is measuring how big a bomb you fly back at the New Zealand nation state until they stop firing rockets at us. It's simple self-defense, and the same politicians that every year remember Kokoda and remember Anzac Day and Gallipoli and remember the fall, and it's okay then for a nation to defend itself. But as you said, why is it not okay for Israel to defend itself? It's mind-boggling, and it really is disappointing, isn't it?
It is disappointing, and I think the reality is now that Israelis believe they're fighting a war for their very survival. So the issue is not retaliation, and what's happened in Gaza is not retaliation. The taking out of Hezbollah is not retaliation. It's a desire to make Israel survive. It's to avoid a second Holocaust in Israel, and Hamas's intentions are genocidal. So that's what's at stake. But we are somehow blocked, many of us in Australia, from seeing that clearly, and we kind of reposition what's happening there in ways that are really not truthful and not realistic. The accusation that the Jews are pursuing a genocidal campaign against Palestinians, I think, is just not absolute nonsense, and yet it's become embedded in so many people's minds.
Yeah, it's pure propaganda. Dr. Mark Durie, I want to welcome you back to 2020 Today.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to be with you.
Mark, we're getting several calls, and I'm really curious to hear listeners' thoughts on this day and the topic of our conversation. And the first one has been very patient. His name is Chris, and he's calling us from Melbourne. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Mark. I just want to say this is Bible prophecy. It's like God's giving a preview. He says in Zechariah that half the city will go into captivity, the women will be raped, and all that sort of stuff. So, and also it's all about which God is right. It's not about land. It's not about anything. It's trying to prove which God is right. If God gave the land to the Jews in an eternal covenant, the other people are trying to prove that their God is right, by getting rid of the Jews. So one thing God does tell us to do, because it's a spiritual battle, is prayer. And he's obviously given a great prayer, like to pray for the Jews. And he said, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So, and that's what we should tell Jews. We pray for the salvation of Jews and the Muslims, but we should be telling the Jews, standing with them, saying, we are praying that God will bless your enemy, bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And one last thing, God does, it says in Isaiah 10:16, I will strike down the sturdy warriors with wasting disease. Now, we could pray that because we know who the enemies of the Jews are right now. They're sturdy warriors.
Okay, well, there's a lot of information there, Chris, but I've taken it on board. Mark, I'd ask for your response. So, number one, Chris is saying it's Bible prophecy. Number two, he's saying we should pray for Israel, and also we should pray that they are successful in their response. So what's your response to that, Mark?
Well, I think we shouldn't be surprised that there's hatred of the Jews in the world, in the sense that I think it goes back to a hatred of God, actually, and a rejection of God's love for his people. So in a sense, that the existence of this hatred is something the Bible kind of warns us about. I think we need to keep a heart of compassion for all players in the Middle East. So we need to see the Palestinians as people with human aspirations and desires who suffer as well. And, in supporting Israel, that doesn't mean that you have to dehumanize the Palestinians, on the other hand. So I think Jesus also said that we should bless even our enemies and not curse them. So we shouldn't be engaged in cursing the darkness. We should be blessing the light. That's just a word of warning about how we respond to this conflict.
That is a great response. And Chris, I want to thank you so much for your call. We've got a number of callers waiting, but thank you for joining us on 2020 Today.
No worries.
And just before we go to the next caller, Dr. Mark, we've had a couple of comments come through, and I like to stay true to my word. I say, I'll read them out. So someone here is saying, I've been praying to God daily for the protection of Israel and its people. Genesis 12, verse 3 or 31, I will bless those, sorry, it's verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So that was one of our listeners, and someone else is saying here on an SMS, yes, the Oz government is definitely not doing enough to support the Jews at this time. So thank you to those people who sent those messages through. We've got another caller waiting, and it is a Liz, and I'm going to bring Liz onto the switchboard now. Liz, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here. There seems to be a bit of buffering, so I'm hoping that the line lasts, but yes, I'm here.
So have you got a comment or a question for Dr. Mark today?
Well, a comment, really. Too many questions. Why do people believe all this rubbish rhetoric would be the first one. But it just strikes me that the Jews have lived peacefully and even helped the nation next to them. How is it that people are able to ignore that? So thank you very much for just saying that we should be responding in prayer and not getting rolled up. That's just opening the door to the enemy to make us behave just as badly. We seem to be losing compassion for people generally around the world as human beings. We're sort of taking sides left, right and centre. And it strikes me that that's a fallout from this whole thing that's going on. And for people who don't think that this thing in Israel is anything to worry about, and not having got the young man that requested a song and hadn't been aware of what's going on in Melbourne, but for those who think it's irrelevant to us here, I was about to fly over there. I have friends over there, and I could feel the fallout because I know people there, but I can see the fallout around the world, regardless of whether you know someone there or not. The behaviour is falling back to, kill or be killed, and it's almost old-fashioned. which is the real comment I wanted to say. Almost old-fashioned, as in Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thinking. And I work at a school. I drive a school bus, and sometimes you'll have seniors who ask you tricky questions. And I work for a wonderful Christian school, and they gave us an hour of training for those tricky questions. And one of those things was when high school students say, God's horrible, he smites us, he killed all these people in the Old Testament, so he's not a nice God. What have you got to say about that? Well, God meets us where we were then, and we were a brutal, bloodthirsty people back then. And we've grown towards God and towards Christ, and God is loving, and Christ exampled that in everything he did. And so I'm able to say to them, we've come a long way since then. The scary part for me is that the Arab states haven't, and they are still a bloodthirsty people, and the Israelis attempt, being the most evolved, as far as I can see, nationality on the planet, as far as living peacefully and being intelligent and using their understanding and their wisdom, the Israelis do that daily. And they still tend the nations around them with health and with humanitarian aid and all sorts of stuff. But I don't see the Arabs. I know there are a lot of Muslim people who are kind and loving as well, but the overall thinking of Hamas and the Hezbollah and all of those is still back in the Old Testament, bloodthirsty, eye for an eye,
tooth for a tooth.
Killed.
So true, Liz.
Yeah.
Liz, I want to ask Mark for a response. Mark, have you got a response for Liz today?
Yeah, one of the most disturbing things about October the 7th was not the atrocities of murder and rape and so on, but that when those bodies or the captives were taken back into Gaza, they were welcomed, with huge enthusiasm by the people. The people were thrilled
and paraded in the street.
Yeah, exactly. So that's it's a loss of humanity, really. And one of the values in Australia is that we should recognise everyone's humanity and respect people even as different from us as they might be. But that's what's being lost in the world today. And I think also it is true that the Arab world is in deep trouble, deep crisis, economic crisis, demographic crises, religious crises. It's a mess. And I believe that Islam is a major driver of that. And that's a sad reality that not all cultures are doing equally well at the present time, and some are really struggling. And I mean, Israel is the only really true democracy in the Middle East, and it would be an absolute tragedy if it was destroyed, as its enemies want to happen. And so that's something we should really speak against and do what we can we should oppose the idea that Israel should be destroyed.
Yeah, and Liz, out of interest, you said you've got friends in Israel. Have you got Jewish ancestry, or you just happen to have Jewish friends?
No, I have Jewish friends, good friends, long, old-standing friends, and his daughter is over there with her children. So he sends me photos of her cooking with her granddaughter, that kind of close friend. And she babysat my daughter when she was 10. So, close enough friends.
Yeah, so you've got a good connection there.
I'm not Jewish myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not Jewish myself. I was going to go to Israel with my church, which was something that I'd wanted to do for a very long time. But let me be honest, I was raised by an atheist and a nominal Christian who wasn't allowed to practice it. And so it was through seeking the truth that I became a Christian. So I have a sharp eye for the truth always. What is the truth? Am I being fed a big line here? Let's just check it out. And in doing that, that's how I came to believe everything in the Bible, everything about Christ.
Wonderful. Oh, well, Liz, I'm just want to have to move on a little bit here because we've got another caller waiting. But Liz, I want to thank you for calling us on 2020 today, and good on you. You've obviously got like you said, a very inquisitive mind, and you're reading and you're studying and you're observing what's going on in the world. And just want to thank you so much for calling in today. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
God bless you, Liz. And we've got another caller who's been really patiently waiting, and his name is Richard, and he's calling us from Austinville, and we'll try and get him on the line right now. Are you there, Richard?
G'day, guys. I had a few comments and questions. I had a conversation probably about 10 years ago with a taxi driver in Sydney. He's a Lebanese Muslim taxi driver. And I was mentioning something about, I think it was 2013, the ex-Australian soldier that went missing by the Muslim rebel group in the Philippines. And he started off at me. He got really narky very quickly and started off about how he didn't like Jews and he didn't like Jewish soldiers and the settlement of the West Bank and this and that. And he come from Lebanese Muslim background, I'm pretty sure. And listening to his feedback and the way a lot of Muslims and a lot of left-wing commentators today are treating the war in Israel. And if you look at history as well, like when the Jews first come into the land in the Old Testament, when Abraham came in and then when they came out of Egypt and God said, you're going to have to fight for the land. Do you see a lot of trends from history now? And because we always talk about, whenever you hear the opponents of the Jews, they always talk about from 1948 onwards and the different wars and the different agreements that the British or whoever else has had in place for the Jewish people and the Palestinians, or there will be other groups, involved in that area in the Middle East. Do you feel like that's part of God's original mandate that the Jews would always have to fight for their land against Islam or different factions in history?
Okay, that's the question, and I'm going to ask you, Mark, to respond to that question. Do you think it's always been part of God's mandate for Israel to defend its borders or its people?
I don't think so as such, but I think it's true for every nation that they need to be ready to defend the security of their nation. So that's one of the role of governments is to keep people safe and keep countries safe. So I think sadly it's been part of the history of the Jews that they've encountered hostility from so many different sources down the ages. But I don't think we should make a comparison between the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites or the Hebrews and what Israel is facing today. It's a different set of issues, and the Islamic hostility that's driving the conflict is a different thing, a completely different thing from what was applying back in the Exodus. So yeah, we need to be careful not to read the past into the present that way.
Yeah, absolutely. But hey, Richard, I want to thank you so much for your call. Have you got another quick question for?
Yes, I do have another quick question. I was listening to something. I think it was Piers Morgan, and there's a British left-wing secular Muslim commentator, and he was talking about the Hannibal Accords that the Israeli army used to protect themselves, and he was trying to say that the Israeli soldiers had actually used it to kill. They wouldn't let any Jewish prisoners come through. They were using it to kill prisoners during the Hamas invasion. Have you heard about that? Do you know if there's any truth towards? No.
I haven't heard anything about that. All I've heard is that when people have investigated the Jewish conduct of their war in Gaza, there hasn't been evidence of intentional, atrocities or abuses like that. I'd be very surprised if that was the case. Yeah.
Yeah, and even Mark, you remember the story where I think 3 Jewish captives, 3 of the hostages, were trying to come back to Jewish lines, and sadly they were killed by their own guys. I mean, unfortunately, mistakes happen in war, and as you said, Mark, there's no evidence of the Israeli state deliberately targeting civilians in their war on Hamas or Hezbollah, but sadly there's always accidents, and I think they call it blue on blue now in the modern vernacular, but it's just a sad thing. But Richard, I want to thank you so much for calling in today. We always appreciate your calls. We've got another caller waiting on the line, but you have a super day, Richard, and thanks for joining us on 2020 Today. And we've got one more call we might squeeze in here, and it is Sheila and David from Frankston in Victoria. Guys, welcome.
Oh, hello. David's not here.
So it's Sheila.
Sheila, yes. Good morning. I'd like to sort of give a few thoughts about what's happening now in Israel. Number one, I think it's absolutely heartbreaking. And we do need to pray for both sides because both sides are so broken and so troubled. But when I was very young, we came over here. We came through the Red Sea. Now, one of my earliest memories during that time was we were in portside in Yemen, and there were these soldiers came on the boat with red hats on, fez hats. They're Egyptian soldiers. I remember saying to my mum, why are they on the boat? And she said, well, they're looking for Jews, but don't worry, the captain's hidden them. And I don't know why she told me because I was only so young. But I knew from that moment on that they wanted to kill them and that there was this horrible hatred. And I think that's what's been going on all the time. And the only thing that we can do is pray for them. And I've got friends who are Jewish. I've got friends who are Arabs. I've got friends who are all sorts of people. We're all people, but honestly, all we can do is pray. Israel has a right to exist and to defend itself. It's God's country. He gave it to them. But we still need to pray and believe. Because Jesus said there'll be no peace until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
Beautiful, beautiful. Mark, have you got a response for Sheila today?
Yeah, I think we need to seek God's heart with these things. I think it's important to realise too that this ideology that drives the hatred of the Jews in the Middle East is also, in the end, opposed to Christians as well. There's a tradition in the Middle East, a saying that says Saturday comes before Sunday, so that the Jews are dealt with first and then the Christians. So, and Palestinian preachers have for a long time targeted the West. And so I think Israel is in the front line of a deep civilizational battle that really would affect all of us. And we should be thinking that actually Israel is a forward engagement with a force that is also opposed to Australians and to non-Muslims in Australia. So we need to see this in a global perspective, a bigger perspective as well.
Yeah, well put. Doesn't he do good answers, Sheila? Mark's got some great wisdom on this topic.
Fantastic. I agree completely.
Yeah. Well, Sheila, I want to thank you so much for calling in. It's a blessing. You say hi to David for us as well.
Yes.
And thank you for your heart, and thank you for your heart of prayer and your love for not only the Jewish people, but you mentioned the Arab people as well. As you said, the heart of God is for the lost, no matter what colour or shape or size they come in. So thank you so much for calling in today.
Yeah. God bless. Bye.
See you, Sheila. Yeah, Mark, some interesting calls there. There's one more comment which I do want to mention. Someone sent an SMS and they said, a small point on Israel. Did Russia send any messages into Ukraine to evacuate civilians before they, started launching their bombs and missiles? And I think we know the answer to that is no. So they're drawing comparisons there on the conduct of Israel and Russia, that Israel, it looks like, are doing everything they can to evacuate civilians from areas of Gaza when they know, or Lebanon, where they know they're going to come in and start targeting terrorists. So,
people are not applying the standards to Israel that they apply in other wars. I mean, in the Second World War, the British and Americans killed hundreds of thousands in bombing raids that were directly targeting civilians, but no one ever said that they were trying to have a genocide of Germans. They were trying to win the war.
Or Japanese. I mean, they firebombed Japanese cities, which were largely made of paper and bamboo, and, I mean, they just burnt.
Yeah,
and
it wasn't genocide. It was an attempt to win a war. And Israel is not trying to wipe out the Palestinian people. The Greens have made a statement accusing them of genocide. It's just wrong. Actually, it's evil because it's so untrue. And the standard that Israel is being held to is not one that people that other nations are held to in warfare. So that's very disturbing and wrong.
Yeah, and another disappointing response from our government when sadly an Australian citizen died who was an aid worker in a convoy. You remember it was bombed by the Israelis, and the way our government reacted to that, they almost made out like Israel had nothing better to do than target an Australian aid worker who happened to be in a convoy, and they demanded an inquiry and an investigation, and it was actually embarrassing. I'll be honest, as an Australian, I was embarrassed by our response because 2 British citizens died in that same convoy on that same mistake that happened, and the British government didn't carry on like that because they accepted that these people were in a war zone, they were trying to help, but they got caught up in a conflict, and it happens, unfortunately, and it just showed a real level of ignorance and immaturity by our government. I think they would even make such a big deal out of that.
I think it was politics. They realised there was a lot of sympathy for the aid workers that were killed, and they wanted to sort of take a stand for. It's just electoral politics driving, a strategic sense of how to respond, and it is disappointing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Mark, this show has gone so quick. I've loved your answers. You've just given some great wisdom and some great insights. I could talk to you about this all day. Just a couple of questions I want to ask you. What made you want to study Islam?
I'd originally done a PhD on the language of the people of Aceh in Indonesia, who are a very Islamic group, and they're very proud of their Islamic heritage. So I knew a fair bit about Islam. And after 9/11, I realized that I understood what jihad was. I understood why they'd done that as attacks. It didn't surprise me that people could do that. And I realized that all around me people didn't understand. So I devoted myself to understanding Islam better. I did a second doctorate on the theology of the Quran. And yeah, it's just it's a lack of understanding of Islam, I think, is a real big problem in our culture. It's a part of a general problem of lack of understanding of faith and how religions work. So yeah, I've been involved in that. And in recent years also, the last decade, also helping Muslim background believers, people that have come to faith in Christ out of Islam, and helping them to find freedom. So that's been a major interest of mine. With a lot of Muslims are turning away from Islam and turning to Christ. So there's a lot of work to be done to help them at this present time.
Yeah, and look, I'll be honest, my desire in this current conflict in the Middle East, I would love to see the Iranian regime crumble somehow in a conflict with Israel, and see the Iranian people become free of that just awful regime, and hopefully allow some of the Christians in Iran to actually come out with their faith more publicly and with a level of freedom, and see the church flourish in Iran. Because my understanding is there's a lot of people in Iran who've secretly become Christians, but obviously can't go too public with it because of the regime.
Yes, more than 1 million probably. And interestingly, what I've seen again and again is that people that have left Islam to follow Christ are often have no problems with Israel at all. You know, their whole view of the Jews changes and shifts. And in fact, I had one friend who he was required to be involved in big public cursing activities in the mosque, cursing the Jews. And one day he said to himself, look, the government hates these Jews. Maybe they might be good people, because the government's not very good, and if they hate them so much, and maybe it's because they're good people. And he came to love the Jews, actually, out of that experience. So I think Israel, the future for Iran could look good if more turn to Christ. 1 million have already. It's the fastest growing church in the world is the Iranian church. And I think the Middle East could shift enormously if that movement continues stronger and stronger.
I agree. And they are beautiful people, the Iranian people, and their culture. They love music and art and food. And I'd love it to become a place like it was in the 70s, where you could go there as a Westerner and have a good holiday there and just enjoy the culture and the people. So, but Mark, that'd be a good conversation for another time, actually, in 2020. I'd love to talk to you about that, about your observations and experiences with people coming out of Islam and finding faith. I think that'd be something I'd love to hit on 2020 with you.
That would be great. And it is an answer to this painful crisis we see in the Middle East, of the change in people's hearts that happens when Jesus takes control and gives leadership for a person's life.
Well, we're going to lock that in, so don't hang up after we finish the segment in about 30 seconds. But I just want to give a plug for an event coming up on Thursday, the 24th of October at 6:30 p.m. at the Belmont RSL Hall, which is on Leake Street and Great Eastern Highway in WA. So you'll be there, and it's called the Clash of Civilisations and the Remaking of World Order. You'll be one of the speakers, as will Professor Augusta Zimmerman, who's also based over in WA. So if you want to know anything about that, go to Mark's website, Mark Durie. That's Mark, DURIE.com. Mark, a really interesting segment today, a great conversation, but with a dark backdrop. Obviously, the slaughter of 1,200 people in Israel on this day 12 months ago. There's nothing good about that, but I want to thank you so much for helping us to remember that event, and also just to reflect on the Jewish people and their ongoing struggle to survive in the modern world.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.